Each being is an extremely meaningful word, a message, a dominical ode, and a divine proclamation. After it has been studied by intelligent beings and has conveyed its meaning to countless readers, its physical form, which is like a letter or a word, disappears. So, after a flower expresses itself, showing numerous and diverse names and presenting the Almighty with His attributes in various forms, so to speak, to the eyes of creation, after revealing His works with His attributes, and after the epiphany of divinity occurs together. Of course, once the flower's duty is complete, and the particles that need to pass over it and make their journey are done. In other words, once their tasks are finished, that flower will certainly say mission accomplished. But during that process, the flower went through various states. The flower bloomed, and it also produced seeds. It turned towards the sun. It spread beautiful scents, became colorful, and changed from one color to another. Perhaps it attracted bees to itself, and attracted butterflies to itself. And now, why is the blooming of this flower truly so valuable? Because there are successive changing states. There are transitions from one state to another. These transitions from state to state, in essence, they are the requirements of the divine qualities. And essentially, perhaps the main secret lies here, in this matter. After these transitions from state to state express themselves, the flower completes its duty. And it disappears from sight, but its meaning remains. But its meaning is not just the appearance of the divine names, as the divine names are already the main goal in themselves. But an even more primary goal than that is the matter we call the divine qualities. The divine qualities essentially stimulate all of these. In a video on a YouTube channel called Star Talk, he says that if everything were eternal on this planet, the meaning of this flower would be lost. The blooming of the flower, its appearance to the eye, would have no meaning. In a situation where everything is eternal, there would be no need to rush for anything. So, you wouldn't need to do this, you wouldn't need to do that. He has written it in great detail in his book. Beauty would lose meaning, the beautiful appearance of flowers, their fragrance, blooming in spring. There is the matter of how your relationship with the environment will fade. But we are speaking in the context of this world's conditions. We are not talking about paradise here. He has done a mental exercise. It appears that without naming it, he has essentially discovered the divine qualities in his book. In essence, on this planet, there is a swift and rapid stimulation mechanism that essentially directs living beings efficiently from one direction to another. And during this time, it presents this for our observation. In other words, we are following it. We derive a pleasure from it, from that following, from the transition from one state to another. For example, the blooming of trees in spring, the fragrance of flowers. In essence, these are beautiful because they will end. If they don't end, they won't hold any meaning. Of course, I am speaking in terms of the conditions of this planet, this world. Of course, I'm not speaking about heaven. In heaven, since all names are independent, it is independent of this mental exercise. I want to say this. What I'm saying is for this planet. I'm speaking for this earth. Within these divine names diagrams, a continuously blooming flower has no meaning. In other words, it holds no originality for people. There is no meaning in a flower continuously giving off fragrance and you constantly being there. The value of life comes from the fact that you come only once. You don't have a second try, right? It's not like you can try again if it doesn't work out. But it really only happens in movies. Some great films have been made. The guy dies and wakes up to the same day every day, and so on. So, there are movies like that. But that's not what I'm talking about. The author doesn't talk about that in his book either. I mean, in this world as it is. But of course, I'm not talking about heaven. If eternity existed, and if the blooming of that flower was an eternal matter, it would lose its meaning. So, the mechanism that provokes these things is apparently not directly related to eternity. The manifestation of the divine qualities apparently necessitates death. This is the main theme of the book, but that person is not aware of it. In other words, the manifestation of the divine qualities, essentially the unveiling of these secrets one after another, and the understanding of the importance of this meaning by people, and the pursuit of this pleasure by people even if it is not named. For example, there is a flower that blooms once every 10 years. People go and wait for it, right? It has a very bad smell, but they wait and take pictures of it. So why is it important? It's important because it blooms once every 10 years. And it disappears in a short time. If it bloomed every day, no one would go to take its picture. Those flowers are beautiful in the spring. In a place where it is always spring, the importance of spring would be lost, just as the blooming of flowers would lose its significance. So, the main driving mechanism here is not the issue of eternity. In the aspect of this place that looks towards eternity, the main driving mechanism is the divine qualities. Yes, it is death that makes everything shine, meaning here. The names of God appear very bright. Here, the attributes and especially the divine qualities are followed. In these Star Talk talks, he is trying to sell his book called Starry Messenger, which, from his perspective, has turned out to be a nice book. He has presented a nice review, but although he diagnosed it well, he couldn't name the divine qualities, of course. He discovered the divine qualities there without naming it. Because of this, he thinks about how events will fall flat. However, the divine qualities require death. This is a very clear thing. The divine qualities we read here ultimately require renewal. Renewal means the arrival of a new one in a brighter form. In other words, there is no tolerance for repetition of the previous one. The divine qualities are such a sharp main driving mechanism. There is no need for repetition. That's why nothing is static in space-time. You know, the solar system with its planets, the stars within the Milky Way, with this and that, the Milky Way, even the galaxy cluster it is in, are constantly in motion. What we reference it against is another matter. In other words, there is nothing static. Everything happens without repetition. There is a path, but who will follow that path to determine if it has returned to its starting point? They estimate 250 million years, the part in the Milky Way. There are even larger paths beyond that. No one is in a position to say, hey, it was here 250 million years ago. Of course, we are only making estimates using mathematical approaches. I don't want to bring the topic to mathematics, just its meaning. The main center of all these is the divine qualities. Divine qualities. The discovery and naming of this matter we are discussing here did not happen in Islamic theology either. Then the truly wonderful and subtle miracles of art to be found in creatures, in particular in animate beings, were disclosed. I understood that these subtleties of art, which are so fine and wonderful, are not only to set forth meanings for the gazes of intelligent beings. For although innumerable such creatures may study each being, their studying is both limited, and not all of them will be able to penetrate all the subtleties of art in those animate beings. That is to say, the most important result of the creation of animate beings and the most significant purpose of their natures is to present to the pre-eternal self-subsistent one's own gaze the marvels of his art and the compassionate gifts and bounties he has bestowed. That is to say, only the Almighty God knows the depth and height of His all-compassionate gifts, even if we do not know. As for this purpose, it satisfied me for a long time. That is to say, in His own view, these changes are so rapid, and they are changes on the scale of the universe that people cannot fully comprehend. Even down to the Planck scale, there is a universe-sized magnitude there as well. I'm not exaggerating with this statement. In these numbers, humans are like something in the middle. I explained this. That is to say, from this perspective, a human is as vast as the visible universe, and the Planck scale we are talking about is as large as a human. Now, make a normal human, enlarge the universe, and again, the human is almost in the middle. Today, these numbers are scientific truth. That is to say, the most important result of the creation of animate beings and the most significant purpose of their natures is to present to the pre-eternal self-subsistent one's own gaze the marvels of His art and the compassionate gifts and bounties He has bestowed. As for this purpose, it satisfied me for a long time, and from it I understood the following: the wisdom and purpose of creation, which is to present the endless subtleties of art in beings, particularly in animate beings, to the gaze of the pre-eternally self-subsistent one, that is, for He Himself to behold His own art, was sufficient for that vast outlay. In other words, why is the universe so vast? In this sense, I could say, what does it matter to you? God is not presenting everything directly to you. I mean, it's vast, but there is wisdom in it. He himself observes his own art. Let me tell you, the universe is even larger. This visible universe is the part you call very large. The unseen part is unimaginably larger than that. I'm saying this scientifically. I'm talking about the period after the Big Bang. The visible universe is very large. We can scientifically estimate the unseen part, but we can't reach it. It's much, much larger. But if you ask, why is it so big? God is, so to speak, presenting his art first to himself, to his own gaze, to the witnessing of his own names. In that case, these expenses may even be considered small. Sometime later I realized that the subtleties of art in the individual features and forms of beings did not continue. The subtleties of this art exist perfectly. They are marvelous. Perhaps the universe has been folded, wrapped, and placed within that artistic subtlety, but it does not continue. It is being renewed and transformed very rapidly. As it is being renewed and taking on another form, the new one immediately arrives. They were being transformed within an endless activity and creativity. There is a continuous act of creation, you know. Yes, continuous creation, an endless act of creation is this. It's not about creating and setting it aside. Everything that is created, think of it in the smallest unit of time, currently considered as Planck time. 10 to the negative 43 seconds. You know, under 1 second, in the denominator, you place 43 zeros next to 10. This is a mathematical issue, of course. No one goes and expands a person to the size of the universe to see what size a person has reached. There is no such calculation. The margin of error does not cover the error of our issue. But, in the end, since infinite energy is not required to do a task, to go from one place to another, since it has been revealed that energy must necessarily be in packets, Planck time and Planck length have emerged. Because, ultimately, infinite energy would be required to go from one place to another if this were continuous. It must be discrete for a number to emerge. If it's not discrete, there's no problem with it. Because you can divide the space between two numbers infinitely. Let's notice this. The numbers between 0 and 1 are greater than the numbers greater than 0. I'm not a mathematician. These are explained and proven. But I say that infinite mathematics is not calculated that way. This is what I understand from divine attributes. Infinite mathematics is not calculated like that. If something diverges to infinity, or if there is a separate mechanism within infinity for that matter, the characteristic of that matter changes. If something diverges to infinity, its characteristic changes, it is no longer itself. If something is infinite, it is no longer itself. It is not as it appears. This means we are scaling the visible part. The visible part is something related to us. In other words, it's the part that mathematicians have discovered and that reflects on them. It doesn't explain the original of the event. I can say this quite clearly, because we are talking about the attributes of God. I want to point this out. But if you say mathematics is already like this, then we can mutually remain silent. If you say mathematics is already like this, then there's no problem for us either. Sometime later I realized that the subtleties of art in the individual features and forms of beings did not continue. They were being renewed and were undergoing change at great speed. They were being transformed within an endless activity and creativity. Endless creativity. I mean, it's not about creating and then setting systems aside. Every particle and whatever is smaller than a particle is continuously and perpetually being produced at every moment to exist in the vast and intricate quantum particle fields, from what we call fluctuations, from the commands of be and it is, in the universe. This is endless creativity. If this production were to cease, everything would instantly disappear. This is the secret of self-subsistence. If this production were to stop, it would instantly disappear from sight. In other words, it's not about creating and making lots of particles, planets, trees, or fruits. Their existence at every moment comes from the throne of attribute, call it quantum fields, quantum particle fields, quantum field theory, or beyond theory, call it the throne. In other words, the manifestation of God's names and attributes in the tree continuously brings these particles into existence. For example, for an apple to exist continuously, it must come from those thrones where the attributes manifest, meaning you should understand it as quantum particle fields, okay? The apple must continuously perform wave movements at every moment. It needs to acquire this movement, which we call the movement of particles. It needs to acquire wave movements so that what we call a particle can be perceived. Scientists say that particles are the places where those waves overlap. We can certainly say, of course, yes to this matter, because the information we have also shows this. The commands coming from B, and it is mean the places where the wave movement peaks, which are the places we can see with our eyes.